Well, 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 good evening.
In the 1970s, Led Zeppelin became the biggest band in the world, gods of rock whose music was impeccable and whose live shows were otherworldly. The band's 1977 tour was one of the most anticipated in history, and Northeast Ohio had just the venue for such a prodigious band. Richfield Coliseum had hosted a who's who of music's biggest acts. Led Zeppelin's two-night stand in April 1977 was a must-see and would produce one of the most coveted bootleg recordings in music history. You're listening to cle-rocks, and this is the story of how a band and a music venue came together during a rock and roll era that was like no other. Led Zeppelin officially formed in 1968, led by Jimmy Page, best known for his time in the Yardbirds, playing dual lead guitar with Jeff Beck. Page would go on to recruit 3 players to help round out what many fans would consider the perfect rock band. A session player named John Paul Jones on bass, former Band of Joy member John Bonham on drums, and Bonham's bandmate, a singer named Robert Plant. The first song Led Zeppelin ever played together was Train Kept A-Rollin', Johnny Burnett's jump blues anthem that the Yardbirds had famously covered. Zeppelin's debut album arrived in January 1969. It was panned by critics. In his review of the album, Rolling Stone's John Mendelsohn called Page limited as a producer and the band a twin of the Jeff Beck group. Mendelsohn wrote, "If they're to help fill the void created by the demise of Cream, Led Zeppelin will have to find a producer and editor and some material worthy of their collective attention." Fan reaction, such as that of Northeast Ohio resident and vinyl collector Craig Bland, was much different.
I was with my cousin, and we went to a guy's house. It was like a small party, and I'm a kid then. All these people are probably 16, 17. And I remember the guy saying, "Hey, have you heard this album? Listen to this." And he put on Led Zeppelin 1. And I remember Dazed and Confused coming on, and I thought, my God, we're having some kind of satanic seance here. And I was mesmerized by the album cover being the Hindenburg. So that was my first taste of them, was that. And yeah, they were a hell of a lot different than the Beatles.
Seeing Led Zeppelin live cemented the band's status as something special. John Gorman, future operations director for Cleveland's WMMS, was finishing up college in Boston when he discovered Led Zeppelin in 1969.
Well, I actually saw them in Boston. In fact, when I got the tickets, they played a place called the Boston Tea Party, which had held about 300 people. And when I bought the tickets at the time, the tickets read the New Yardbirds. They had not. The show was actually booked before they settled on the name Led Zeppelin, and it was just an amazing show. Imagine being in a place where I was actually right at the front. There were no seats. It was a 300-seat sort of a open club, and that was the first time I saw them, and that blew me away. At the time, it was this was the beginning of the guitar guy. Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, and Jeff Beck left the Yardbirds, and Jimmy Page took over, and you had the people that were following Jeff Beck and said he's going to be the big star, and then you had other people who were looking at Jimmy Page, and he's going to be the big star. And it was funny because, in Jeff Beck's first solo album, he did You Shook Me, and Led Zeppelin did the same song. I think it was a Willie Dixon song, and they did the same song on their first album. So, there was, and little did people know that, Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page still continued their friendship. In fact, Jimmy Page is uncredited, but he played on Beck's Bolero on Jeff Beck's first album. But it was still at a time when, you had the guitar gods, and the 3 big ones were Clapton, Beck, and Jimmy Page.
With the Beatles breaking up and the Rolling Stones just hitting their creative stride, Led Zeppelin entered the 1970s as the biggest band in the world and was only getting bigger.
They were right up there with the Rolling Stones. I mean, they were one of the biggest bands. I mean, it was like, by that time it was before the Beatles broke up, it was the Beatles, the Stones, and Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin just came out of nowhere. They were so fantastic. I mean, that first album, really captured everybody. And when they followed up with an equally strong album, I mean, it just cemented them. They were one of the first rock superstars.
As Led Zeppelin's career was taking off, Cleveland was reaching its peak as a music city. WMMS had grown into one of the most important radio stations in the country. Music venues like the Agora, Music Hall, and Allen Theater were hosting acts on the verge of big breakthroughs, including Bruce Springsteen, Black Sabbath, Patti Smith, and David Bowie, who played his first U.S. show in Cleveland in September 1972. Still, the area lacked a music venue the magnitude of other cities. That's when Nick Milletti, owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, developed the idea for Richfield Coliseum, which would become ground zero for major live events in the Midwest. Music historian author Peter Shakarian recalls the venue's early history.
It was like sort of the epicenter, and I think that's a lot of what Nick Milletti wanted when he opened the building. He wanted it to be pomp and circumstance. He had convinced himself that at some point Cleveland and Akron were going to eventually merge into this gigantic metropolis. He eventually thought that because those two cities would merge, that Richfield would sort of be like the middle of this gigantic, metropolis that we would maybe turn into like the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, or we'd be on some trajectory like that. A lot of people will complain about that building as, not being a sonic delight, not, beautiful for concourses, kind of a log jam for any event because there was one concourse serving both levels. The sight lines weren't great, but, as anybody else will tell you, I think, add a few beers, we'll travel. Some of that was a part of it for sure. It was a bit of a right place, right time kind of thing as far as the building goes. But again, I think that speaks to that time period, 1974, when that building opened up. Rock and roll was really exploding and sort of shifting from what it was emerging as in the 60s as being counterculture to sort of being more absorbed as this gigantic pop cultural phenomenon that it became. And, obviously in the 70s and into the 80s, the corporate people sort of took notice and figured there was a way to make it bigger and faster and more. And so that was going to keep rolling as long as there were audiences to see it.
Legendary crooner Frank Sinatra would play the first concert at Richfield Coliseum in October 1974. In the first year, the venue would host the likes of Elton John, Stevie Wonder, Santana, Elvis Presley, the Eagles, and Led Zeppelin on the band's 1975 tour. As Shakarian remarks, things only got bigger as the 1970s carried on.
It's important to know just how many different artists really sort of, I don't want to say cut their teeth, because some of them had already cut their teeth by then. Springsteen played 14 shows at the Richfield Coliseum during his ongoing career. The December 31st, 78, January 1st, 79 sort of cemented that legend, that special relationship, if you will, that Cleveland has had with Springsteen from that 1978 Agora concert. But, Aerosmith played there 12 times, and in July of 1988, they introduced the Guns N' Roses. That's a big deal. Kiss played 12 concerts there, including a really huge Rush, which basically, if it was not for Cleveland, Rush would not have maybe broken the way that it did. They played 13 concerts during that time period. And of all kinds of other, really, sort of big and important shows that happened in that 20-year span.
Richfield Coliseum's impact on Northeast Ohio was tremendous. John Gorman recalls it solidified Cleveland as one of the great rock and roll cities in North America.
We didn't have the largest, the largest venue at the time was Blossom. In those days, Blossom was limited as to the amount of rock and roll acts that were played there. So Public Hall, for all practical purposes, was the largest venue in the region for regular concerts. So when the Coliseum opened, it was really a venue that was very much needed in Cleveland. The Cleveland audiences at the time were probably the best rock audience that a band could hope for, because this city was very much into rock and roll, very much into new music. And, like a band like Roxy Music would come to town, and, they'd say, well, here's a song off their new album, and they'd start to play it, and everybody was being applauded. And you look at a lot of these bands saying, they already know the song. But that was the Cleveland audience. The Cleveland audience was very, very rock-oriented and very much into the music at the time.
Several high-profile rock and roll tours took place in 1977, but none were more anticipated than Led Zeppelin's North American run. The tour would become Led Zeppelin's biggest ever, with tickets selling out in record time. Craig Bland recalls the chaos of attending a show in Cincinnati and then hearing about the show at Richfield Coliseum in April.
three buddies of mine went to see him at Cincinnati, and we're probably, just to give you the magnitude, we're probably the first 10 people to try to get in one of the doors. It was all general admission. So one of the doors starts opening up, and some dude is trapped between the door and the handrail, so the door can't open fully. Well, everybody behind us starts pushing. So I was lifted off the ground, being pushed so hard I couldn't breathe. I couldn't draw a breath. It today is the greatest thing I've ever been to. They were unbelievable, loud and bombastic, and 3.5 hours. So I had a buddy who saw Zeppelin there that next week at Richfield. He says, I'm on 271, that damn 2-lane traffic freeway. We're backed up. He goes, I can see Richfield, but I'm still, miles away. He says, next thing I know, these black limos, 4 of them, go speeding by me on my left side in the berm, in the median. So he said, I'm going with them. So he says, I got in that median and followed Led Zeppelin's limos till I got, almost to the end. And, of course, I had to get off because the cops were all over me.
Led Zeppelin shows had become the stuff of legend by the time the band returned to Richfield Coliseum. Yet behind the scenes, the band members fully embodied the era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The 1977 tour was full of backstage turmoil. Fan arrests became regular occurrence. Heroin had become such a part of the band's life that doctors would accompany Led Zeppelin on tour to administer prescriptions to keep the guys going. Such a lifestyle would inevitably lead Led Zeppelin to Swingo's, the hotel that would serve as the party palace for rock stars coming through Cleveland during the 1970s. The hotel would become immortalized in Cameron Crowe's film Almost Famous.
Hi, welcome to Swingo's Celebrity Inn. You must be Stillwater. It's Bowie!
Led Zeppelin would routinely run up bills over $10,000 at Swingo's. The band arrived at the hotel the day before its April 27, 1977 gig at Richfield Coliseum. John Gorman recalls the band members setting up shop at Swingo's and repeatedly phoning into WMMS's request line that night.
I do remember when Led Zeppelin played there. I know that they destroyed at least one room. I'm sure there was more. The interesting thing with Led Zeppelin is they came into Cleveland the day before the show. And that night, Betty Corbin did 10 a.m. to 2 a.m. She did that shift. We had a request line and we had a hotline, and the hotline was ringing, and she picked it up, and it was Led Zeppelin. It was Robert Plant and Jimmy Page. They didn't want to be interviewed. They didn't want to go on the air, but they started to make requests. Hey, do you have this song and this song? And they were shocked that we had a lot of those songs. So they were requesting a lot of old blues songs and, some off-the-wall songs that you wouldn't expect. And they were shocked that we had those songs in the library.
Led Zeppelin's wild ways didn't prevent the band from putting on a show the following night. Photographer Janet McCoska took her place at the front of the stage, stationed below Robert Plant and Jimmy Page, and shot the entire 3-hour gig.
It was great because there was no hurry. You could really look at Robert Plant and look at Jimmy Page and see what was coming, or just focus on the players and take your time. And I remember but it was between Jimmy Page and Robert Plant, and if you can imagine just being there for 3 hours and watching these guys, it was like the ultimate rock and roll experience.
McCoska's photos of Plant are particularly striking. Just 2 years removed from a car accident, the iconic frontman stood tall, shirt open with a commanding presence unparalleled in rock history, save for the likes of Roger Daltrey or Freddie Mercury.
He was a majestic lion. I mean, I don't know if he invented the look and the sound of rock and roll singers for all time, but Robert had it all down, and he was very charismatic. I mean, he was a big stud guy. I mean, he would just stand there and allow the women to admire him. There's a shot from that show. Robert was on stage and someone floated a inflatable Zeppelin, and they floated up to the stage, and he grabs it, and for, again, that 60th of a second, it becomes this giant phallic symbol, and then he threw it back in the audience.
Some of the most infamous tales of Led Zeppelin's tours involved the band members' sexcapades with young ladies of varying ages. Music reporter Lisa Robinson followed Zeppelin on multiple tours in the 70s and quotes Plant as saying, "I've met members of the opposite sex who were only 8 or 9 when we first went into the studio, and they're great f***s." McCosker bared witness to Plant's promiscuous ways while photographing that first night at Richfield Coliseum.
Robert had some cohorts on stage. I don't know, they were roadies. He had one on the left and on the right behind the speakers, and he would look into the audience and and pick out the girls, women he wanted to come backstage afterwards. So it was like, it was like going to the candy store. So he'd stand there and he'd point, and one of those guys would run out and give the little woman, a pass for backstage, and so for 3 hours he was working it.
Whether April 27th, 1977 was one of Led Zeppelin's greatest shows from a performance standpoint is something the band's diehard fans have debated for years. But everyone agrees it is one of Led Zeppelin's most iconic concerts, thanks to a coveted live bootleg known simply as Destroyer. The bootleg is a sound recording of that first night, striking in its quality and one of the most sought-after concert recordings in music history. But how it came to fruition is shrouded in mystery, though Craig Bland has a theory.
I either read somewhere or heard somewhere how that got loose was they recorded most of their shows off the soundboard, and John Bonham would take several of them and re-listen to them to hear himself and see if he could do any tweaking. And allegedly he got in some kind of argument, fight with Page, and he knew how much Page hated bootlegs, so he took the soundboard recording and tossed it to somebody and said, "Here, you take," and that's how it got out.
Indeed, one of the 4 LP versions of Destroyer even thanks Bonham for use of the tape. Yet regardless of how it happened, Destroyer is an astonishing listen, the sound of the greatest band in the world at the height of its amplitude, at a time when rock and roll was never bigger. Bonham's drum solos hit even harder. Page's guitar work is piercing with passion. Even the mistakes, Page's fingers getting stuck in his guitar strings on Sick Again, coming in too early on Cashmere, are mesmerizing. During Battle of Evermore, Plant's vocals bounce off their own echo thanks to a perfectly timed vocal delay. John Paul Jones and Jimmy Page's interaction on the acoustic portion of the set is majestic. But the highlight of the night has to be Achilles' Last Stand. Page's magnum opus is delivered in fine form. It stands as one of the best live versions of the song you will ever hear. Performance of Stairway to Heaven would inspire a 10-minute standing ovation from the crowd, before the band would return for an encore featuring rock and roll and Trampled Underfoot. The second night of Led Zeppelin's Richfield run would also feature a fan recording that would be exchanged among collectors. Some argue Zeppelin put on a better show that second time around. However, the sound quality of night one remains unmatched.
That was Led Zeppelin peak experience, peak live powers, and, the wheels really came off the band.
2 weeks after a 2-night stand in Oakland, Robert Plant received a phone call while in New Orleans. His 5-year-old son had been rushed to the hospital with a respiratory infection and died. Plant returned to England, and the 1977 tour came to an abrupt end. It would be 2 years before Led Zeppelin would perform live again, but the band never toured in full. John Bonham would die on September 25, 1980. The band would officially call it quits 2 weeks later. Bland remembers anticipating Led Zeppelin's scheduled 1980 North American tour that never happened.
Yeah, I had submitted Richfield Coliseum. They were going to come there, and you submitted a money order by mail, first come, first served, to get tickets. And I got a note that I had made it, and I was going to be sent tickets. And then John Bonham died. Next thing you know, I got my money back.
Richfield Coliseum would remain a premier music venue well into the 1980s and 1990s, hosting legendary concerts by Bruce Springsteen, Prince, Michael Jackson, Metallica, Bon Jovi, U2, and numerous others.
Springsteen in particular, because he's the one that sort of had the most rock and roll concerts there during the time the building was open. He often would come through Cleveland before he would hit big places like New York, because he could try out things on audiences here and the audiences would eat it up kind of without judgment. So he could pretty much do no wrong here, and I think would feel then emboldened to go from a place like Cleveland into New York City or to a place like Los Angeles where he knew the critics were going to kind of have him under the microscope, and he really, his guts were all in check, you know what I mean? And I think for a lot of acts that came through Cleveland, they felt like they'd let their hair down here too, and that's something that I think is part of that bygone era of this building being gone too.
The storied venue would close its doors in 1994 after the Cleveland Cavaliers moved to a new sports complex in downtown Cleveland. The final concert at Richfield was headlined by Roger Daltrey. Richfield's final days would bring to an end perhaps the greatest era of live music Cleveland had ever seen.
That was one special time. My theory with that is there was so much good music happening at that time, and I think it had everything to do with the fact it was the baby boom generation. There were just more people being born during that period of time. And as a result, you had a lot more musicians and you had a lot more of an audience for them. That was why rock and roll and rhythm and blues and, all of these genres of music all started to gel together and appeal to a wide audience.
Richfield would remain vacant until 1999 when it was torn down. The site that once housed the Coliseum is now a woodland area, but the remains of a parking lot and a section of Route 303 are enough for those who visited the venue during its heyday to remember it vividly.
It's kind of like when you have a picture hanging up on your wall and you haven't painted for a long time, you can sort of like when you take the picture off the wall, you can just see that sort of outline of whatever, that grime or whatever, sort of where the picture is. It sort of feels like that for me with the Coliseum. I can drive past there and, there's space and you can see where it was, but you can almost kind of see in your mind's eye where it was too. Like your brain sort of makes that space kind of fill the ether and ozone around it, like where it would have been, sort of fill in where it was.
All interviews for this podcast were conducted by cleveland.com. We'd like to thank John Gorman, Janet McCoska, Peter Chakarian, and Craig Bland for their contributions. Thank you for listening to CLE Rocks. I'm Troy L. Smith. Until next time.
Good night. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.